Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of Dublin City Council, I would like to welcome you to tonight's webinar, The Great Brunswick Street Ambush of March 1921. My name is Tara Doyle, and I'm a librarian with the Dublin and Irish collections in the Dublin City Library and Archive on Pearse Street. And by the way, Pearse Street used to be called Great Brunswick Street. The library building is very pertinent to our talk this evening. The address of our building is 138 to 144 Pearse Street, and it is the headquarters of Dublin City Libraries, containing a public library, a conference room, a reading room, offices, and specialised storage facilities. And the present site was extensively refurbished and extended in 2003, and house numbers 143 and 144 Pearse Street were subsumed into the footprint of the library building. The house at number 144 Pearse Street was once the headquarters of the 3rd Battalion Dublin Brigade IRA, but now it contains the library's conference room on the ground floor and a series of offices upstairs, including my own work desk in the attic of number 144. Our talk tonight focuses on a gun battle just outside number 144 Pearse Street, and the plaque you saw earlier is on the front of the house. The talk is going to be about 45 minutes long, and we'll have a few questions afterwards. You can ask questions by typing into the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And my colleague, the Deputy City Librarian, Brenda Teeling, is going to moderate the Q&A session after the talk. Our speakers tonight are Liz Gillis and Cathy Scuffil. Liz Gillis is an author and historian from Dublin's Liberties. She has a degree in history and currently works as a researcher for the History Show on RTE Radio 1. She is the author of 6 books about the Irish Revolution and is co-organiser of the annual conference on the burning of the Custom House in 1921. In 2018, Liz was a recipient of the Lord Mayor's Award for her contribution to history. Cathy Scuffil has an MA in local history from Maynooth University. She's the Dublin City Council Historian in Residence for the south side of the city. She has written a number of local history books, and an abridged version of her MA thesis was awarded the Old Dublin Society's Silver Medal in 2018. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Now, over to you, Liz.
Thanks a million, Tara, and just like to say a huge thank you to DCC City Libraries and Tara yourself for the support for and hosting the talk tonight that myself and Cathy are going to do. So I am going to kick things off because the Battle of the Great Brunswick Street ambush, or the Battle of Great Brunswick Street, it took place on the 14th of March 1921, but we're actually doing the talk on the actual day. It happened on a Monday, pretty much around this time. Everything was going to kick off, and the ambush, the battle took place right in the heart of the 3rd Battalion area, but the ambush didn't just happen out of the blue. To understand the importance of the Great Brunswick Street area in the Irish Revolution, we have to go back to the beginning. So I'm going to set the scene, and then Cathy's going to follow on and actually talk about the ambush. So and when I mean go back to the beginning, I'm talking right back to Na Fianna Éireann, because Pearse Street, Great Brunswick Street, it's there right from the start. Here you can see St Andrew's National School on Pearse Street. Many of you probably know it. And Countess Markovich, who was the co-founder of Na Fianna Éireann, she went to the local headmaster in St Andrews, and she told him that she was thinking about setting up this organisation, Na Fianna Éireann, basically the equivalent of the Irish, the Boy Scout movement that existed, Baden-Powell's Boy Scout movement. And she was looking for recruits and seeing if any kids might be interested. He put it to the kids in the school, and lo and behold, the first members of Na Fianna were the kids from Pearse Street, including Leo Fitzgerald, who you see in this photograph, and 4 of his brothers. So you have boys from Pearse Street, Great Brunswick Street, in the movement right from the very start. Now, Leo Fitzgerald has a direct connection to the Battle of Great Brunswick Street, which Cathy will mention later on. Now, moving on to 1913, we had the Home Rule Bill was put on the statute books in 1912. The Ulster Volunteer Force, they were set up to resist the introduction of Home Rule. And in response to that, we have the Irish Volunteer Force being set up to protect Home Rule, for want of a better word. But also you have the Irish Citizen Army being established around the same time. And here we have both organisations, Irish Volunteers on my left and the ICA on the right. And whereas the ICA were it basically one unit, you have men and women involved. There was a Boy Scout section to that. The Irish Volunteers, they were set up along brigade lines. So you had Dublin Brigade, Cork Brigade and so on. And brigades were broken down into battalions and broken down into companies and sections and so on. So where does Pearse Street fit into the Dublin Brigade of the Irish Volunteers? Well, that was in the Sword Battalion area. So 1916, there were 5 battalions in the Dublin Brigade. 1st and 2nd battalions operated on the north side of the city. Dividing line would be O'Connell Street. The 3rd and 4th battalions operated on the south side of the city. The dividing line would be Camden Street, definitely. Patrick Street, Kevin Street, a bit like no man's land. And then you had the 5th battalion who were operating out in Fingal. So that's the setup when we come to 1916, the rising. And by God, did the 3rd battalion play its role in 1916. And just to show you exactly where the 3rd Battalion area was on this map of Dublin City, you can see it there. Marion Square, you can see it, Great Brunswick Street, what is now Pearse Street. But look at the items that are circled. So they're barracks, they're just some of the police and military barracks that were in the 3rd Battalion area. So the enemies of the volunteers in that area. You've got Dublin Castle, you've got police there, you've got also British soldiers there, as in Ship Street Barracks. You have, by 1915, the police station at the top of Pearse Street, and then just down the bottom right we have Beggars Bush Barracks. So that just gives you an idea. Portobello Barracks, was now Cattlebrew Barracks, would also be in that area. So there was a lot of police and soldiers in the area. And just a closer look at the breakdown of the 3rd Battalion, as in where companies were, because there were 6 companies, I think, at the time of 1916 that did extend, but a company operated around Camden Street to Parliament Street. B Company, which is where Great Brunswick Street area fits in. You can see it there. It is Dawson Street to O'Connell Bridge. C Company, South Richmond Street to Westmoreland Street. D Company, Ringsend, Sandymount, Marion Road. E Company, Leeson Street out to Mount Pleasant Avenue. F Company out as far as Dunleary. But just focusing in on B Company, just to look at it there. Dawson Street to the Lear Street and straight back to the end of Pearse Street. That would be Baggot Street, the Canal and the Liffey to O'Connell Street. So there we are, Great Brunswick Street, firmly in the middle of the B Company area of the 3rd Battalion. And as Tara mentioned, 144, that was the headquarters of B Company, and later became the headquarters of the 3rd Battalion. So you're all aware of this building, and we see there the plaque commemorating the fact that it was the headquarters. But let's look at some of the officers that were members of B Company and A Company, but people that went on to make a huge mark in terms of the Irish Revolution. So Eamon de Valera, he was captain of E Company. Some of you may have heard of the term Dev's Own. That refers to E Company because that was the company he was part of. But by 1915, he was actually the commandant of the 3rd Battalion, so the man in charge. Michael O'Reilly, the O'Reilly, didn't live too far away from Pearse Street. He was captain of B Company, and he was killed while leading the charge out from the General Post Office on the Friday of Easter week. Joseph O'Connor, a name that is very prevalent in the War of Independence. He was commandant of A Company, so those that would be operating around Wexford Street and so on, but he later became commandant of the 3rd Battalion. And then we have Sean McMahon, who was captain of B Company, and later, after 1916, he became the quartermaster general. So he was actually on the GHQ staff of the IRA. So there you've got some big names that are associated with 3rd Battalion, but also with B Company. And when it came to 1916, the biggest success that the volunteers had in 1916 happened in the 3rd Battalion area. So they were in Bolands and had control of the railways to stop basically the British reinforcements that would come from England to quell the rebellion. That's exactly what happened. The Sherwood Foresters arrive at Dunleary. The volunteers basically make it really difficult for them. But then when they came to Northumberland Road on the 26th of April, you have the Battle of Mount Street Bridge. 17 volunteers led by Michael Malone and George Reynolds in both number 25 Northumberland Road and Clanwilliam House were looking up Northumberland Road from Clanwilliam. They inflicted casualties of 234 killed and wounded on the Crown forces. And you can see there just to the right the memorial, the inscription on the memorial to the volunteers who died. But the biggest success of the Easter Rising, it took place right in the heart of the 3rd Battalion area by a handful of volunteers, 17 volunteers. Now, after the Easter Rising, so the leadership, as we know, were executed, the volunteers, thousands of them were sent to prisons and Frongach, the internment camp in Wales, but they did reorganise when they were released from prison in December 1916 and mid-1917. Joseph O'Connor was elected the OC, the commandant of the 3rd Battalion, and the number of companies in the battalion increased. Now that happens across the board. When we come to the War of Independence, there were 13 companies in the 3rd Battalion. Those that later joined were then put into their own brigade area towards the end of the War of Independence. Although they had men, they always needed arms. So one of the first things to start doing is to raid for arms and ammunition. And Sinn Féin, which had been the nationalist party. It was not a Republican party before 1916, but thanks to the British and the media, they labelled the Rising the Sinn Féin Rebellion. Massive mistake, and it meant that there was a ready-made political party there, which the volunteers took over, and it became the Republican Party. 1918, the conscription crisis, the British government in their wisdom decided, let's conscript thousands upon thousands of Irishmen. They got a big no from pretty much the majority of the whole country. Another major mistake they did was that they fabricated the German plot. It was a way to basically undermine Sinn Féin, get rid of all the key players in Sinn Féin. They came up with this idea that the volunteers were in cahoots with the Germans again for another rise, and they'd stop it before it would start. So arrest them all. And that includes Eamon de Valera, Countess Markovich, lots of big names. Some that didn't get arrested were Collins, Harry Boland, and Cattle Brewitt, amongst others. It backfired on the British government because everyone knew what they were up to. We then had the war ending. Very soon after, the general election was announced because there hadn't been a general election. The Irish Parliamentary Party were the dominant political party. That completely changed with this general election because Sinn Féin, although the majority of people that they put forward as candidates in the election were in prison, they won. Out of 105 seats, they won 76, I think. Wiped the board clean. They were now the dominant political party, a Republican Party, who on their ticket said they would not take their seats in Westminster. They would sit in an Irish Parliament, which they did on the 24th of January 1919. And those who weren't in prison, do you see the photograph? You're probably aware of it. It's a very small group of people, but they were those who were free, who could actually attend the first meeting of Dáil Éireann. But on that day, by pure coincidence, you had the events down Sola, Headbeg and County Tipperary, where members of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade shot and killed 2 RAC men who were escorting a consignment of gelignite. Purely happened by coincidence. It was not arranged like that, but this is then seen as the beginning of the War of Independence. And the War of Independence in Dublin, it tends to be dominated by Michael Collins, the intelligence war, so the activities of the squad, and later then the active service unit. But there were 4 battalions in Dublin. You then had a 5th. It wasn't Fingal, it was the engineers. That changed slightly. But the early days of the war was dominated by the intelligence war. Now, you had G Division, the Dublin Metropolitan Police were in Dublin, but G Division were the political division. They were based in Dublin Castle up to 1915, but these were the policemen who identified the leaders in 1916, who were very well aware of who was who in the volunteers, and from within their own ranks, Eamon Bry and some other people basically gave their services to Collins and the volunteers and said, if you want to take them on, this is how you have to do it. You have to beat them at their own game. And that's exactly what they did. Collins was made Director of Intelligence in 1919. And you have, what that meant was that his men, chosen men, would literally gather information on who was the police and who was looking for them and so on. They would send warning to those policemen to stop their activities against the volunteers. If they did, they'd be okay. If they didn't, they would pay the ultimate price. What was going to happen to those men? They were going to be assassinated, and assassinated by the men you see in the lower section of the screen there, the squad. The 12 Apostles, called that because initially there were 12 members. And again, young men, specifically chosen, and just to point out some of them, you've got William Stapleton, Paddy Daly, Charles Dalton. Now, he was intelligence, he wasn't a member of the squad, but the intelligence officer had to go with the squad members to actually identify the target, and Joe Leonard. And the photograph on my top right, this is the type of information that they were gathering, and this is a photograph of the G-men, and you can see they're numbered and you've got their names, but look at number 7, dead. So that was someone who was targeted by Collins's assassins. And look where the headquarters were. Look where these men were stationed, right at the top of Pearse Street, in what's now Pearse Street Police Station, and moved there, as I said, from Dublin Castle in 1915. Now, the first assassination takes place in July. It was against a detective called Smith, but very soon after you have the killing and the shooting of Detective Daniel Hoey, who had been really active against the volunteers. Where was he shot? Where was he killed? You can see there from the photograph, it's actually Townsend Street. It's at the back of the police station. He was shot just yards away from going into the police station. They were brazen about the attacks. And just you can see here from the newspaper report, detective killed, shot outside Dora Police Station. Detective Constable Daniel Hoey was shot dead in Townsend Street, Dublin last night. The crime was especially daring as he was shot practically on the doorstep of the detective office of the DMP. Deceased, to his age about 30, was a native of Edenderry and unmarried. The appalling crime is surrounded with mystery, and so far no eyewitnesses to the murder have presented themselves to the police. It is known that the deceased was engaged yesterday, so literally hours before he was shot, in company with other officers on duty in Harcourt Street and other districts of the city. Harcourt Street, it was number 6 Harcourt Street, which was the Sinn Féin bank and headquarters of Sinn Féin. So he knew where to go, and that's what makes him the target of the IRA. But these assassinations continued and were very successful in undermining the British intelligence, Dublin Castle's intelligence. They were completely caught off guard. But then things start to change as we come into the early months of 1920. The RIC, who were the police in the country, they were being targeted by the IRA in the country because they were the eyes and ears. But there were resignations. You couldn't get recruits into the RIC, so the British government had to look elsewhere. And they raised 2 forces. The Black and Tans, they arrived in March 1920, and then in July, the Auxiliaries. Now, just to sort of explain the difference between the 2 groups, so Black and Tan, so called because their uniforms were just a mix and match, and it was a nickname that was given to them very quickly. They were ex-British servicemen, and they had fought in the First World War. It has been said about both these groups, they were taken from the prisons. They weren't. They had fought in the First World War with the Auxiliaries. They were officers. They were certainly criminals when they got over here, but they weren't criminals before they got over here, not that we know of, and they certainly weren't taken out of prisons. But the Black and Tans were a full-time force, so they are full-time policemen. They were going to get the pensions. They were basically would be here for as long as they wanted to be. But the difference with the Auxiliaries were they were a mobile, temporary unit. So they were attached to help the police around the country and in Dublin City. But they were made up of ex-officers, so decorated men, very skilled men, and really, really became feared in Dublin and the country. The thing is that both of these groups made their presence known very, very quickly, pretty much as soon as they arrived in Ireland. But just look at the companies that were in Dublin of the auxiliaries. There were 13, I think, in the whole country, so a small group force compared to the thousands that were in the Black and Tans. But in Dublin you have Depot Company, which is Beggar's Bush, so just round the corner from Pearse Street. FZ and S Company, Dublin Castle, not too far from Pearse Street. Q Company, they arrived later, and they were in the London and Northwestern Hotel just across the Liffey from Pearse Street. And then our company, so you have the auxiliaries, you have the DMP, and then you have the British soldiers, the ordinary soldiers in Dublin, and again replicated around the country at the time. Now, the day that changes everything in 1920 is Bloody Sunday, and again you find the 3rd Battalion are right there involved. They're right in the middle of it. And look at the location. So this map actually shows you the addresses, the locations that were hit that morning. So the thing was that although Collins and his men had undermined the intelligence network, the British government reorganised, and they had a new chief of intelligence, General Ormond Winter, the Holy Terror. He brought guys over from England, and these were to be completely invisible. Weren't meant to know who they were. They weren't in the police barracks. These men were here as businessmen. They were living in lodging houses around the city, and they were having quick successes against the IRA. So someone had to move first. Collins decided it would be him. Got the information from everywhere, maids, from the intelligence officers, from people working in Dublin Castle, even from the RIC themselves and DMP. The date was chosen 21st November 1920. And at 9 o'clock that morning, you have units of men, IRA, going to these addresses, knocking on the doors, and all hell breaks loose. You had 14 men killed immediately. A further one died of his wounds later on. But pretty much all of those addresses are in the 3rd Battalion area. So you're going to find guys that were from the 3rd Battalion are involved in the assassinations that morning at certain addresses. And there you just have an example of the newspaper reports. Appalling weekend, many Dublin officers killed, shot in hotel and lodgings. And then, of course, we have the follow on from that, which was the shootings out in Crow Park, where the auxiliaries, the military were going out to raid it. The auxiliaries and police get out there and they just open fire on the crowd. And again, killing 13, 14 people and wounding scores. The civilians, of course, paying the ultimate price. Now, just to show you some of the addresses that were targeted that day. So 28 Upper Pembroke Street, this was the worst. This was the descriptions where it was like an abattoir. This was believed to be the headquarters of British intelligence. It's a double fronted house, and that's why that area was targeted. Now, the group was led by Paddy Flanagan. He was actually C Company 3rd Battalion. Charlie Dalton was there as the intelligence officer. Now killed there were Captain Price, Major Dowling, Colonel Montgomery. He was the one that was fatally wounded. Wounded there was Colonel Woodcock, Lieutenant Murray, Captain Keenley's side. 119 Lower Bagot Street, that's B Company. So B Company 3rd Battalion, lads from the Pearse Street area. They were sent there, and it was there that they killed Captain Begali. Then we have 92 Lower Bagot Street. Again, B Company 3rd Battalion were sent there, and at that address they killed Captain Newbury. And with the auxiliaries, now as I said, that day changed everything. But then a week later, you have the Kilmichael ambush in West Cork, led by Tom Barry and the 3rd West Cork Brigade Flying Column, where they wiped out 2 tenders of auxiliaries, because the auxiliaries were brazen. They were fearless. The IRA had to put up to them. They did that at Kilmichael. In Dublin, they had to do it. The first attack on the auxiliaries in Dublin was carried out by members of the 3rd Battalion of the Dublin Brigade. It was A Company, and it took place at the post office out in Ballsbridge. Now, another way of getting the intelligence was to seize the mails. So the IRA, they were taking the mails, intercepting all this postal traffic. They're either seizing it, raiding for it with the post offices, or actually getting it from the post mistresses around the country. But here you just have an example of the headline or an article describing the events took place on the 14th of December 1920. Bombs and bullets, brisk engagement, no casualties reported. An amazing incident took place at Ballsbridge Post Office yesterday morning when a mailbag was reported to have been seized from auxiliary police by armed men, who then made their escape in the motor car which they had conveyed to the escort to the scene. If you read the accounts by the actual participants of that attack, it was a much bigger affair. It did go on for a few minutes, and there was a lot of bullets and bombs flying about. But the first attack on the auxiliaries in Dublin, carried out by members of the 3rd Battalion. Now, after Bloody Sunday, again, the British were caught off guard, completely taken by surprise. They react. You have Ballykinlar internment camp being set up. You have mass arrests of guys, just thousands of fellas being taken out of their homes and just interned and put in prison. Crow Street had been the base of HQ intelligence. It was right under the nose of Dublin Castle, a stone's throw away from it, but they had to move their premises. Where did they move their premises to? You've guessed it, Pearse Street, and here, to offices above what was the Palace Cinema, what is now the Academy. So basically what you're seeing here is that Pearse Street has a very, very strong connection to major events that happened in 1909, 1913, 1916 and beyond. Now, after again the events of Bloody Sunday, so with guys being arrested, guys had to go on the run because they were known to the authorities, and they couldn't rest. They could not rest on their laurels, the IRA. You just couldn't have this one hit and that was it. So it was decided in December 1920 that the IRA should actually set up a full-time force, because the volunteers, they were what their name says they were volunteers. Guys were working in the day who could work, they were carrying out ambushes at night. This was a volunteer army. So an active service unit was set up, and this would be a small group of men, 50 in all, with men from each of the Dublin battalions, and they would be a full-time paid unit. Their only job was to take the fight to the enemy. They were to attack at every opportunity, which they did. But who was chosen to lead, to be the commanding officer of the active service unit, was a 3rd Battalion man, Paddy Flanagan, who had been in charge of the shootings at 28 Upper Pembroke Street on Bloody Sunday. And just to say, the setup mirrored the battalion setup. So number 1 and 2 section, they operated on the north side of the city. Numbers 3 and 4 sections operated on the south side of the city, and for big engagements they would come together under the direct control of the IRA General Headquarters. And the big thing was they were to take the fight to the enemy. And just to show you some of the members of number 3 section, so there you have it. You can see the addresses and you can see the companies. You've got Christy Cruz, there's Patrick Wall, there's Joseph Kelly, there's Harry Sankey, I think it is, John Bean, C Company, A Company, B Company, G Company, A Company. So you can see men from the various companies of the 3rd Battalion were involved. And here's some others, some photographs of some of the members. This photograph is taken in 1939 of the surviving members of the active service unit, and amongst them you have the 3rd Battalion men, and you can see it there, George White, Michael White and James Doyle. So not only have we got a list, but we've also got some images of the members as well. Now, just to point out to you again, as I said earlier on, the War of Independence has been dominated by the activities of the squad, and later the active service unit, or the big events like the Collinstown raid, Airdrome raid and so on. But just look at what was happening in the 3rd Battalion from January to June. So 6 months, 1921, the last 6 months of the War of Independence. Here's a list of all the attacks and ambushes that they were engaged in, and the different companies. So you're talking K Company, E Company, C Company, B Company, all of them. In that 6 months, there was 45 attacks launched by the 3rd Battalion against the Crown Forces and the police and so on. So that was a lot of activity that was taking place in the 3rd Battalion, in and around College Street, Pearse Street, Merrion Square, the surrounding area of what was Great Brunswick Street. But to bring it up to the 14th of March 1921, and to explain exactly why the battle or the ambush did happen, the people of Dublin and the members of the IRA woke up to this news on the 14th of March 1921. And it was the executions of 6 young men in Mountjoy, 6 volunteers, 6 IRA men in Mountjoy. The British had started the executions in November with Kevin Barry. He was the first to be executed since the leaders of 1916, difference being they were shot, Kevin Barry was hanged. These men were hanged as criminals. They were not given the soldier's death. The difference between Kevin Barry and these executions and the executions that followed was that they then hanged them in 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s. You know, 5 in a day, in this case 6 in a day. So you see this increase from January 1921. A lot of guys were executed, and this was a huge blow to the IRA, their morale. And just to talk about those who were executed, you've got there Patrick Moran on the left. He was a member of D Company 2nd Battalion. He was charged with the shootings that took place in Mount Street. He wasn't there. He was actually over in charge of the shootings that took place in the Gresham Hotel. But he was found guilty of the Mount Street shootings. Thomas Whelan was a member of E Company 3rd Battalion. And he actually, although from Galway, he had moved up to Dublin when he was 18, and he lived in Barrow Street, so just down the road from 144. And he was charged with killing Captain Begali on Bloody Sunday. Now, the other 4 men, they had been arrested on the 24th of January 1921. Frank Flood, Patrick Doyle, Bernard Ryan and Thomas Bryan. They were executed for their part in the Drumcondra ambush that took place on the 24th of January 1919 or 21. And Frank Flood was only 19 years old at the time of his execution. He was actually a very good friend of Kevin Barry's. They were the men who were executed that morning. And just to show you some of the headlines here, you have 6 hanged in 2s at hour intervals, 40,000 people at the jail at Mountjoy. They thought there might be a reprieve. You can see there photograph just showing a tiny portion of the crowds that were outside Mountjoy. Everyone was there. And there you have another article, March to Die Cheerfully, Chaplain's Words, great tribute by Dublin, execution in 2s. They were hanged at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and word was then filtered out by 8:25. And you just have it there. 6 young Dublin men walked with extraordinary fortitude to the scaffold in Mountjoy jail yesterday. They're paying with their lives for offences alleged against them. And in all of this, we do see that these men were volunteers, but we often sort of forget to look at who the person was behind these names. And so many human stories just are there, and they are heartbreaking. An example, Patrick Doyle, so one that was arrested after the Drumcondra ambush. He was a member of F Company 4th Battalion, and his wife had just given birth to twin daughters. He was a father of 3 kids. You can see from this newspaper article, death of her child. A sad incident in connection with the execution was that at the funeral of one of the twin daughters, Louisa Patricia of Patrick Doyle. She was buried yesterday at Kilbarrack. On Saturday evening, Mrs. Doyle went to prison to see her husband, taken with her 2 newly born children and Kathleen, her 9.5-year-old daughter. On the way back and outside Berkeley Road Church, one of the twins died. So the day that her father was executed, the child was buried. Another twist and tragic twist in this family's fate, Sean Doyle. So Patrick and Sean were brothers, and you've probably seen some of the letters the last letters the men have written. They've been up online and stuff. And one that Patrick wrote to Sean, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says basically, I hope that it won't be too long until we see each other. You can see there from the date 30th of May 1921. It wasn't long, it was 6-7 weeks, because Sean was a member of the active service unit, was involved in the attack, the operation, the burning of the Custom House on the 25th of May, was fatally wounded, and he died on the 30th of May 1921. And I'd just like to say, just mention a passage that Thomas Whelan wrote to his comrades in the IRA, particularly in the 3rd Battalion. And what he said was, "Give the boys my love, tell them to follow on and never surrender. Tell them to pray for me, especially Dev's own," and that refers to E Company, 3rd Battalion, Dev's old company, and the company that Thomas Whelan was a member of. "I will pray for them. Tell them I am proud to die for Ireland." But added to this tragedy was the fact that their comrades didn't get closure, their families didn't get closure, because the bodies, as was the case with all of these executions, the bodies were not given back to the families. And we just have this photograph of the grave in Mountjoy Jail of not just those 6 lads, but the other 4 that were executed in Mountjoy, but being remembered by their comrades. All of those events lead to what happens that evening, because the IRA were not going to let the enemy, the Crown forces, away with the events of that morning. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Cathy.
Now, just bear with me for one moment while I get my slides up and running here. And just want to say a huge thank you to Liz for actually bringing us right through this so well that we can actually work out the story of the Battle of Brunswick Street. So it falls to me tonight to bring you through the ambush and the aftermath. And as you can see, there were events that morning, but who would have thought that the Battle of Brunswick Street is actually connected to this grave in Glasnevin Cemetery? So hold that thought, because we're actually going to come back to that. This is just inside the gates of Glasnevin. And by the time I'm finished tonight, we'll have worked out the link between that and what happened in Brunswick Street 100 years ago on this very day. It happened on a Monday night, but it was yesterday was the actual anniversary. So, as the headlines of the day showed, this is another bloody affair in Dublin. It's picking up on the idea of Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday had been well labelled as such, but now Monday, the 14th of March 1921, becomes the worst day of political violence since that date in November. 13 people were to die violently on this day, and there is another one, the forgotten person, never included in the overall figures that are given because the person died later. As Liz has shown you, that morning in Mountjoy Jail, 6 IRA volunteers were executed. By the evening in Great Brunswick Street, today we know it as Pearse Street, 2 IRA volunteers are to be killed in action. 2 auxiliaries will also lose their lives. 3 civilians are killed in crossfire and the 1 other. And there are 7 people injured, some very, very seriously. As you know, in the morning, the volunteers had been executed. But remember, this is Dublin, pretty much under martial law. There's a curfew enforced by 9 o'clock in the evening. And this is enforced by British troops and auxiliaries that patrol the streets of the area. As a result, the locals, people who are coming from their place of employment, quickly clear the streets. Citizens are hurrying home. There's an air of fear in the air because people know there's going to be an IRA retaliation. It's expected for the hangings that took place that morning. It's well known and well recorded that armed IRA men were actually patrolling all around the Great Brunswick Street area and in the laneways and the alleyways around the close to the street itself. Just a couple of little things about the actual building at 144. As I say, Brunswick Street, Great Brunswick Street is today Pearse Street. It was the main city route and a tramway route from Ringsend to the city centre. So it had its own Lewis, if you like, it's Lewis of the day. Number 144, as Tara mentioned earlier and as Liz alluded to, was actually the St. Andrew's Catholic Hall, connected with St. Andrew's Catholic Church on Western Road, and also close association with the school, St. Andrew's School, a little bit further down the street. As you know now, that's all part of Dublin City Library and Archive. And also, as Liz mentioned, in 1921, it's the company headquarters of the 3rd Battalion, but it had been associated with the 3rd Battalion pre the 1916 Rising. And just to show you this is an extract from the Tom's Directory. And to give you a flavour of what Brunswick Street was like, it's a mixture of private homes. So you can see there at the top of the page, we've got, for example, the Kellys living in 133, the Merrimans in 134, Quinns are in 34. There's a butcher shop on the corner of Ernst Street. And then on the other side of the road, we actually have a grocery shop. So it's a mixture of shops and private houses. And as you work your way through, there's the Lara Dairy. And at that time, 138 to 42 were at the public library, the Carnegie Library, as it was described at the time. Moving along there, you can see 144 St. Andrew's Catholic Club, and next door was the Working Men's Benefit Building Society. So it's a mixture of business premises, a library, there's a post office across the road, churches around the corner, and it's also heavily residential area, really well served to the city centre with an active tramway moving by the doors. First incident on the night of the 14th is this, an attack on the DMP barracks. Today we know it as Pearse Street Garda Station. In this incident, volunteer Sean Dolan, an IRA man, he fires a grenade at the DMP barracks. It became a target. It became the symbol of British authority in Dublin. And he throws a grenade at the barracks, but the grenade bounces back. It explodes right in front of him. He's brought by ambulance to Mercer's Hospital, but the ambulance fire brigade crew state that his injury had occurred as a result of a tram accident. He subsequently loses his leg as a result of this incident. This happened at 8 o'clock, just 1 hour before the curfew. We are almost at that time now. The auxiliaries in Dublin Castle are sent out to investigate. There's word has come back, there's been an explosion in Pearse Street, in Brunswick Street. They send out a Rolls-Royce armour car and 2 tenders, but their destination is not the barracks, the DMP barracks. Their destination, based on information they have received, is 144 Great Brunswick Street. They were told there was a certain number of gunmen on the premises. So they had received information from somebody. And as a result of the explosion, they now move directly into the area. There's an armed convoy on its way to 144. And just to draw on Google Maps, we get very modern at times, to set it exactly where we're talking about. If you can see the very large building in the middle there, that's the library, the DCLA headquarters in Pearse Street today. 144 is here, right beside it. So you can see it's now part of the library complex. So here we have the Great Sandwith Street junction, the railway station at Western Road. The church will be just up a little bit further from that. And then the other junction is Ernst Street. Now, to bring you back in time, you've seen the modern image there in front of you. I'm bringing you back to a map of 1913, which is pretty much the scene. Again, you can see the library site, the big square there. You can see the active tramway running up the street here. And here are the buildings of 144 working their way along the remaining buildings along Great Brunswick Street. The railway station is there. The church will be just, as you know, a little bit further up from the railway station itself. There's a myriad of little terraces and routes off Great Brunswick Street, very familiar to the locals, residential streets served by the certain amount of commercial activity that would have been on Great Brunswick Street itself. So, as I said, the convoy is on its way. It's about this time. They're moving their way down towards 144 Great Brunswick Street. When they arrive there, the street is dark. If you look out your house windows at this very moment, you can see how dark it would have been. The light had been extinguished on the street. There's an armed guard waiting for them at St. Andrew's Hall. That's 144. There's an immediate firefight when the convoy arrives. It seems the convoy is expected. It looks like the IRA men have been made aware that this convoy was on its way from Dublin Castle, and there are immediate casualties in this firefight. The only part of the Rolls-Royce armoured car to be shot out are the tyres of the vehicle, but that renders it immobile. The rest of it, because it's an armoured car, is impervious to the small arms fire being used by the volunteers on site. But there is a heavy machine gun, a Vickers machine gun on top of Rolls-Royce tender. And it now commences to spray bullets on all of the surrounding houses, bearing in mind that a number of these are private residents. A certain number of the auxiliaries too actually have been cut down in the opening fire, but the remainder clamber out of the tenders and start returning fire. And all around the street, guns are flashing from rooftops, from alleyways, from street corners, from upstairs windows. In fact, from the upstairs windows of 144. It seems that the attack is coming from 3 or 4 sides of the street. It lasts for about 5 to 10 minutes. It varies. Different accounts give you a different amount of time, but it all seemed to happen very, very quickly. Civilians on the street actually fall to the ground to avoid bullets. There are casualties all around, and there's injured and dying lying in the street as a result of the actual battle that took place on the site. Newspapers tell us that there was a hail of fire from 3 or 4 sides of the street, but what is certain is there was widespread terror in Brunswick Street and the surrounding district. And immediately the traffic to and from Ringsend is suspended, and that included the tram. In fact, the trams for Dunleary and the trams for Ringsend were all caught up at College Green and up at the Pillar. And they were held there until after 10 o'clock that night, meaning many people in Dublin that night were placed outside of their area, outside of curfew. Can you imagine the terrors in different homes as word would have been filtering back? Remember, this is pre-radio, pre-mobile phone, pre-internet. People are finding out by word of mouth. There's been an incident in Pearse Street, an incident in Great Brunswick Street. The trams are stopped. People are caught up all over. There must have been a terrible air of fear right across the city, as far out as Dunleary, as no trams were getting through. And trams that were on the route were now being stopped and searched, people taken off them onto the street itself. And yet there's still sporadic gunfire going on in the area. In that 5 or 10 minutes, there are 7 mortally wounded. That's by newspaper accounts. There is 1 more. Of them, there are 2 auxiliaries. So we have section leader Joseph Beard and temporary Colette Francis Farrell. Now, Beard, as you can see, was the section leader. He would have had a big military career before coming over to Dublin. Of the 2 volunteers that are cut down, one of them is Leo Fitzgerald. Now, Liz mentioned him at almost the beginning of her talk. Him and his brothers were among the first to be recruited in the National School in Great Brunswick Street by Countess Markovich when she was recruiting for the Fianna in 1909. He had a long service with the IRA right through from the Fianna days. The other chap from the IRA that is killed in the immediate gunfight is Bernard O'Hanlon. The 3 civilians and the 1 forgotten. The 3 civilians were Thomas Asquith, David Kelly, Stephen Clark, and 1 woman, Mary Frances Morgan. And Mary gets left out of most of the story, and there is a reason for that, and we'll come back to it in a couple of minutes. There was 2 IRA captured, a Thomas Traynor and a Joseph Donnelly. The remainder of the IRA fighters got away across the rooftops, over back walls, around the back streets, through the alleyways. They scattered in all directions from Great Brunswick Street. And the British troops then are brought in to basically cordon off the whole area, and they're brought up from Beggar's Bush Barracks. Now, Liz mentioned those in proximity to Brunswick Street. They called in the reinforcements as quickly as they possibly could do. But as soon as the troops arrived, there were no further arrests that night, which just shows that they had actually managed to scatter out of the area pretty quickly. And there was sniping and sporadic gunfire for several hours into the night and well beyond the curfew itself. Now, just to give you a little bit of background of each of the casualties, well, Cadet Francis Joseph Farrell, 28, he was actually born in Dublin, but his family lived in Birmingham. So he's a Dublin man with a Birmingham family, and he had service throughout World War I. He was initially with the Royal Fusiliers and later joined the Tank Corps, and that would have put him right in the area of the Battle of the Somme, because the tanks were used for the very first time in that area in World War I. In the Brunswick Street ambush, he is the first to die. He dies instantly. He's the driver of the leading tender that was escorting the Rolls-Royce armoured car. Days after the ambush, his body is removed by steamer to England, and later on his sister is awarded £1,000 compensation for the loss of her brother, and you can actually see the small newspaper account that I found in that connection. The second auxiliary killed this gentleman, section leader Bernard Beard. He was 36 years of age and a native of Nottingham. He had seen service in Central Africa, in Poland, and in a lot of other centres during World War I. He was injured in the shootout outside 144, and he died on the 15th of March. So today is actually his centenary anniversary of his wounds. Again, his body is removed by steamer to England for burial. And in a little poignant addition to the story, his wife Alice, who was a Nottingham lace heiress, lost her first husband in a motor accident in 1914, and she now loses her second husband as a result of the action outside 144 Great Brunswick Street 100 years ago. This is actually an image that I managed to source. I was absolutely delighted to see it, which shows the removal of the 2 auxiliary down to Dunleary. So you can see that their fellow soldiers are giving them the salute as the bodies are being taken away. Now, to move to the IRA, well, Leo Fitzgerald, as we know, he went to school in Andrews Street, in Andrews National School in Great Brunswick Street. His family were a painter and decorator family located at 173 Great Brunswick Street. That was a little bit further up the street, nearer the railway line as you're heading towards the city centre. And as we know, he had been in Na Fianna since the school days and then later on in the IRA. He's also killed instantly in this ambush, and his funeral went to St. Teresa's in Clarendon Street first, but he also had a second funeral mass held for him in Iona Road. In another addition to the story, his home was actually raided late on the Tuesday night following the ambush, and they took away letters and documents and also examined quite a number of items of clothing, and they discovered that some of the clothing that Leo had been wearing on the night of the ambush were actually washed and hanging out on the line at the back of the home. They also, when the auxiliaries raided the house, they went right through to the top and checked out through skylights, and then went into an adjoining premises to to tell the owner that his skylight window was open. So they were looking for something specific. They don't seem to have found it, but everything in the house was up for inspection. Other members of the family had close association with the IRA as well. The other young IRA man killed was 18-year-old Bernard O'Hanlon, and he is from Dundalk. Now, he worked as an assistant to the pawnbroker, Mr. Cunningham, of Earn Street, and he actually lived on the premises with Mr. Cunningham. He left the home of Mr. Cunningham at 6:30 when the working day was over to take a walk, and that was the last that the Cunninghams saw of Bernard O'Hanlon. He lived 9 hours following the ambush, and he died in King George V Hospital. That's St. Bricken's Hospital over near the park. His body laid unclaimed and unidentified until eventually he is identified by Mr. Cunningham himself, the pawnbroker from Earn Street. And later his father and brother came to take the body to Dundalk, where the funeral took place. Now, there were 3 civilian casualties. Later on, there was a military court of inquiry. And in the military court of inquiry, they found that the civilians had been killed by persons unknown, and added this little rider. If they were killed by the IRA, they were murdered. But if they had been killed by the Auxiliaries, it was accidental. So I think that really shows us an awful lot and tells us an awful lot about the biases of the actual military courts of inquiry that were taking place at the time. It's almost as if Dublin really is in a state of war. And the fact that we don't even have proper post-mortems shows that the events are so different to what they would be today. Now, to bring you through the civilian casualties, the oldest of them was Thomas Asquith. He was 68. He had been a butcher all his life, but in retirement, he became caretaker to the Frame family, who were running the Hammond Lane Foundry at 111 Great Brunswick Street, which puts this further down the street in the direction of Ringsend. Thomas and his wife had been standing at the front gate outside their home, which they were given as part of caretakers to the Hammond Lane Foundry. And they were watching the tram passengers being searched as they were being taken off the trams by the British soldiers who had arrived from Beggars Bush. A stray bullet fires in a general direction, and it hits Thomas Asquith in the stomach as he stood there with his wife. It narrowly missed his wife, who was standing beside him. And I have on the screen the actual entry in the death register of the city for Thomas Asquith. His death was notified by his son, also called Thomas. It's a sad event for a bystander. He wasn't even one of them who witnessed the actual events further up the street. He's standing outside his home further down, and where he worked in the Hammond Lane Foundry. He was rendered first aid by another employee of the foundry, and after about an hour, they managed to attract the attention of the troops from Beggars Bush to indicate that Thomas Asquith had been seriously injured, at which point they discovered he had actually passed away. Now, another casualty of the ambush, and this would have happened directly outside the library premises, was this man called David Kelly. David Kelly is 50 years of age. He lived at 132 Great Brunswick Street. He's one of the people that I was showing you from the Tom's directory earlier, a residential street mixed with shops, mixed with the library, post office. He lives in 132. He's caught in crossfire as he leaves his home. Some accounts suggest that he was on his way to warn them in 144 that the raid was about to take place. He was also lame. He suffered from a withered leg, and this may have been the deciding factor in him being unable to take cover properly as the gunfire started to break out around him. The other thing about David Kelly is that he's a prominent member of Sinn Féin. In fact, he's the head of the Sinn Féin Bank. He's also the brother of Tom Kelly, the veteran Sinn Féin politician, the famous alderman, by 1918, a member of Parliament, and also he had been the chairman of the Housing Committee in Dublin and was responsible for the building of a number of houses in and around the Dublin area. His funeral took place to Weston Row, and in his obituary in the newspapers we're told that he gave his life for Ireland. So he's Sinn Féin, but he was more Sinn Féin Bank than actual Sinn Féin, but he is possibly the man who was warning them of the ambush, hence the preparedness of the IRA men, the armed guard at 144 when the tenders and the Rolls-Royce vehicle arrived outside the premises. Now, the other casualty is this gentleman, Stephen Clark. He's 22 and he's an ex-soldier. And the newspapers tell us that he dies while he's going home. However, there's a bit of confusion with this one. His family home certainly was 2 Rostrevor Terrace, which is off Boyne Street, not too far from Great Brunswick Street. But this is where it got a little bit interesting. It's stated that he fell while trying to bring a woman to safety. Now, also there's an internal report about Stephen Clark suggesting that he had been under observation from the IRA and that he may have been an informer for the enemy. Was Stephen Clark the man who told the Auxiliaries that there were armed men in 144? We'll never know. It haven't been able to find that actual fact, but it is quite possible it was him. In an ironic twist to this, his funeral was shared with that of David Kelly. The 2 coffins were brought to the church on the same day, so his funeral was fully attended by all Sinn Féin and councillors and other people who were supporters of Sinn Féin. So the 2 funerals took place side by side in Weston Row. Then Liz found this photograph, and this photograph shows us small railway bridge, and it tells us that it's Queen's Terrace, and it tells us too that this is where Stephen Clark's body was found, and also that a Mary Morgan was found seriously injured, both of whom had been shot. Just to set the scene for that, here is the ambush site clearly marked on the map just beside the library in Great Brunswick Street, and Queen's Terrace and Queen's Lane are a little bit further up the street, but off the street, out of the line of fire. Was Stephen Clark shot by somebody leaving the scene of the ambush? Was he shot by some of the people who were sleeping over the walls and over the rooftops, as we heard earlier? And was Mary Morgan just caught in crossfire? Well, I found another newspaper account which gave us more detail of Mary Frances Morgan, and she is the forgotten victim of the Great Brunswick Street battle. She was born in Queen's County and she's a dressmaker. She's living in Queen's Square. Today you know it as Pearse Square. And she's hit, as they say, by a stray bullet. And the reason she is left out of all accounts about this event is that she dies of injuries almost a month later. At that stage, other incidents had been happening in the city of Dublin. The events of Great Brunswick Street are now filed under a list of events that took place in the city, so many of them involving the 3rd Battalion. By the time her military court of inquiry into her death has taken place, they could only trace one living relative. I think it's a nephew, and he declines to come to the inquiry. So there isn't anybody even to speak for her at the military court of inquiry. But she certainly was found beside Stephen Clark, and at the time that the newspapers were covering the Great Brunswick Street incident, they mentioned that she had gained consciousness in hospital a few days after the event, and then seems to have been completely forgotten. But then I discovered she died of her injuries on the 11th of April, 1921, the forgotten victim of Great Brunswick Street. In a prologue to the whole event, and to bring us right back to 144, the following day, that was Tuesday the 15th, by date today, it's raided by the Auxiliaries. They come back and they are now trying to find more information about the whole event, and they do tremendous damage to the interior of the building. In fact, it's described as being demolished, and included among all of that were the private housekeeper's accommodation. Mrs. Clark was the housekeeper, and she had a private room on the premises, and they absolutely wrecked that as well. The list of items that are destroyed gives you a good picture of what the interior of the building must have looked like. So a large mirror is shattered, souvenir clock is smashed, the billiard table is ruined. It is, of course, a club, a Catholic club. It was a social club, a place for people to go to. The windows were broken. In fact, the windows were broken with all the billiard balls. The auxiliary took the billiard balls off the table, fired them through the window. And a big bookcase that was also on the premises was smashed up. An amount of pictures were torn off the wall, including among them a view of the Vatican that was completely wrecked, and also portraits of Connolly, Pearse and Clark. We do know, of course, that it was the headquarters of the 3rd Battalion. But intermixed with Connolly, Pearse and Clark were portraits of priests associated with Weston Road Church, and they were also pulled off the wall and destroyed during the auxiliary raid. Also at this time, raids were carried out in St. Andrews and Weston Road South, including the crypt. In fact, they were let into the crypt by the sacristan. They had a look around, checked the whole general area, left again, and came back a short time later and searched it once more. And they also searched the sacristan home, and they went down to St. Andrews National School further down the street. Anything associated with the parish was now being searched and pretty much wrecked in the process by the auxiliaries. The air retention in Brunswick Street and the subsequent days following the ambush were really, really strong. Here's the crowd that gathered outside 144 after the auxiliaries had wrecked the interior of the building. So you can see it would have been a huge talking point in the area. People were coming out to see what had happened. Again, you're only reliant on newspapers. You haven't got radio. You haven't got phone. You've word of mouth. So people came out to see what was happening. Crowds are gathering here outside 144. And the attacks continued. The following day, a British soldier shot and killed at Rialto Bridge, not far from the city where I'm from. And 3 days later, in Dorset Street, another ambush on British troops. The day after that, in Wexford Street, another huge incident. 3 British soldiers are killed and 5 are wounded. This is a grenade attack. There's a steady escalation of shootings and bombing, culminating in the Custom House, the burning of the Custom House in May, and the conflict generally continues until the truce on the 11th of July in 1921. Of the men that were captured, this is one, Thomas Traynor. Now, Thomas Traynor was a bootmaker. In fact, he was the bootmaker in Frongoch camp, appointed as such by Michael Collins. He's originally from Tullow, County Carlow. By 1921, he's the father of 10. He's an Easter Rising veteran, and in another unconnected link, he's living in Cantfort in Mount Brown in the houses that have just been constructed by Alderman Tom Kelly and his efforts on Dublin City Council. In his court case, he states that he had no part in the ambush itself. He had only been asked to bring an automatic pistol to 144 Great Brunswick Street. However, he's found guilty of the killing of Cadet Francis Joseph Farrell, and he's hanged in Mountjoy Jail for that killing. When the word comes out, his wife Elizabeth, who's standing outside the prison gates, collapses into the arms of friends, and his small child cries bitterly. His little son is crying bitterly at the gate. The family asked for a return of the body, but he is also buried in Mountjoy. They reckon that the hanging of Thomas Traynor may have been in reprisal for another incident in County Tipperary, where the IRA had kidnapped the RIC inspector, Gilbert Potter. When word comes back that Thomas Traynor has been hanged, the IRA then execute Inspector Gilbert Potter. So the cascade of events following the Battle of Brunswick Street are never ending. They just seem to continue one after the other. The other man who was captured in Great Brunswick Street during the battle was a man called Joseph Donnelly, but he was only 17 years of age. He was also sentenced to death, but was spared. Was it because of his age? Or maybe it's because of the truce. But one thing that Joseph Donnelly leaves us is a detailed account of the events of the Battle of Brunswick Street in the Bureau of Military History. He wrote his witness statement in 1951. However, that is 30 years after the actual incident itself. Thomas Traynor becomes one of the forgotten 10 in Mountjoy, the men who were interred in the grounds of Mountjoy Jail. This becomes a huge issue, and here we have a picture of a mock funeral that was arranged. In the centre there we have Maud Gonne, the lady with the cladder brooch. This is a religious service that was arranged for the Forgotten 10 as if it was to be a funeral itself, because it's a hugely contentious issue in Dublin that their bodies hadn't been released to their families for burial. However, there's another little link, and this brings me back to my earlier slide. In October 2001, the bodies of Thomas Traynor, the man executed for his part in the Great Brunswick Street battle, along with the 6 volunteers who had been executed in that morning, and 3 others, including Kevin Barry, were formally taken from Mountjoy and re-interned in Glasnevin Cemetery. They were given full military honours, and several thousand spectators were present in Glasnevin at the time. Crowds of ordinary Dublin citizens lined the route from the Pro-Cathedral to Glasnevin, applauding the corteges as they passed. Just contrast that to the fear-filled streets of Dublin, the executions and the sudden eruptions of violence all through March 1921. That's a picture of the corteges arriving in Glasnevin for the state funeral. And I have a quote, a picture of all of them present, including there on the bottom, Thomas Traynor. These are all the people who are reinterred in Glasnevin. And Thomas Traynor, of course, is the big link to Brunswick Street, but also the 6 who had been hung earlier that morning is the other link, because if those hangings hadn't taken place, tensions wouldn't have been as high in Dublin on the day of the Brunswick Street ambush. But Thomas Traynor is among those that was reinterred. As a little prologue, Thomas Traynor is one of 3 trainers involved in the Irish Revolution. One was killed in 1916 at the South Dublin Union, John Joseph Traynor. The second is Joe Traynor, who's killed in Bloody Sunday in Croke Park. And the third is Thomas Traynor, executed for his part in the Brunswick Street battle. They are all distant cousins, all generally related, and 3 members of one family who have their roots in the Carlow, Tullow, that Aughrim area of Ireland. The quote, the graveside oration by Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, I have it here, and he just says that the country was under tremendous pressure at the time when these men were executed. There was a united effort. Dáil Éireann was developing, democracy was being put to work, and independent civic constituting things were being set up, including the Dáil courts. Things were beginning to function. The 10 had seen the light of freedom, and that Ireland would one day be free and independent. With thanks to you all, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and a major thanks to Tara and the team in Dublin City Library and Archive, and of course to Liz Gillis, my comrade in arms tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cathy and Liz, for a fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed it. And I suppose one of the things about history is that the research never stops. And we've had some comments about a bit of confusion about one of the people spoken about. And I think Liz is going to come back in maybe and answer that. So I'll hand you back to Liz for the moment.
Yeah, firstly, so sorry to the family of Donnelly, John Donnelly. Seriously, we made a mistake there. I've read his witness statement. Cathy's read his witness statement. It was a complete mistake on our part. So we are so sorry. John Donnelly, not Joseph Donnelly, and it will be corrected. And thank you so much for pointing that out. Please accept our apologies. Complete mistake. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Liz, and thanks for that. I do want to thank the family members for joining us tonight, indeed, for correcting those things, because that's important. We like to get things right. Yeah. And from our point of view, I have to say, those of us who work in the library in Pearse Street, who pass down the street every day, well, in normal times every day, and walk in and out the doors, it really is fascinating to think of what went on 100 years ago. And I think certainly for me, it will certainly change how I view the building itself and the street outside. And I suppose for those of us who have family who were around on the other side of the river at the time, you do wonder what our, my grandfather or great grandfather, what they thought of what was going on in Dublin at the time. As I think, as has been said, it must have been fairly scary, very horrifying for a lot of them. Let's have a look at the questions. We have a couple of questions, so we'll see how we get on. So our first question is just read from Noel Gorman. Noel says, my grandfather lived in Mark Street around this time, and asks, is there a detailed list of the first children to join up from St. Andrew's National School? I don't know which one of you wants to take that.
Yeah, not that I can see on military archives. So military archives in the pension section have the nominal roles, the organisation roles of the different organisations, IRA, FINA. I was just having a quick look. There's like 140 pages relating to the FINA, but it's all the different units. I would say to you, check out finaairinhistory.wordpress.com. It's a site run by Eamon Murphy, who's the grandson of Eamon Martin, who was one of the founding members of Na Fianna. He's one of he becomes the leader of Na Fianna in the War of Independence. And Eamon it's an amazing site. You just don't know what you're going to discover. So that's the place I would check out first, because Eamon pretty much is going through his grandfather's archive. So that's where I would search first. Definitely get in touch. You can contact, I think, Eamon through his website, finaairinhistory.wordpress.com. Okay,
thanks very much, Liz. So next question is from Jane. Jane asks, is it true that the Cumann headquarters was also in Great Brunswick Street? And if so, were the two headquarters closely located?
Cathy, do you want me to?
Yeah, you go for that one. Go first.
In 1914 up to 1916, at least, Cumann HQ was in 206 Pearse Street, Great Brunswick Street. So yeah, not too far away at all. And you do find, just as you start looking into the different areas and different company areas and so on, that they were so closely aligned to each other. Branches of Cumann, very close, are probably sometimes in the same building. Like Camden Street, number 34 Camden Street is the prime example. You've got Na Fianna, you've got Inina, you've got the Irish Volunteers, you've got the IRB, you've got everyone using the same building. But in that case, it's 206 Great Brunswick Street and then 144 for the Volunteers.
That's great, Liz. Thanks. Cathy, did you want to come in there?
No, I'm grand. Grand. I'm still down at Great Brunswick Street, Brendan.
So we'll go on to the next question. So thank you from Jerry. This is great talk, Liz. How did the IRA gather intelligence, and why were they so effective, as they didn't have all the resources that the Crown forces had?
No, well, I suppose Liz will certainly come in on this one, but they were of a place. But I think we've really shown tonight how even the victims, the people IRA, they were all living in and around the area that this ambush happened. They're part of your local community. They're involved in your local parish. They're well known, like David Kelly, for example, his brother was even on the council. So they are very much in their communities and of their communities. And this is the atmosphere that they're living in. The British are at a massive disadvantage because what they have done is they brought the auxiliaries over and they don't even know their way around the city. They're finding it as they're going along. So, you know, this is an example of local community really working. And I think what they realised when they raided 144, the auxiliaries realised it's part of a network. It was in some way connected with Westland Road Church. It's in some way connected with St Andrew's National School. Hence, those items are raided the following day. Liz, have you anything to add?
Yeah, well, just in sort of how they collated information and where other information was coming from right under the nose of the British. Dublin Castle, Lily Mernon, Lieutenant G, she's just literally saying, look, going to whist drives with the Auxiliaries and then pointing them out to the IRA fellas. You've girls in post offices, you've got Jenny Cleary, who was working in the Munster and Leinster Bank, fellas depositing money in their bank accounts. They were given information in the bank book, maids in the houses, the policemen, RIC men. Collins's eyes and ears were everywhere, and it was amazing just when you start looking at where the information was coming from. It was a huge counter-intelligence network that really took on the British. They thought they could do the spying. Thanks to Ned Bry and Dave Nelligan, McNamara and Kavanagh, the guys that were in G Division working as clerks or policemen, they went to Collins and said, this is how you do it, because they had the inside knowledge, and then Collins just ran with it, and everyone jumped on board. But the information was coming from everywhere.
Thanks very much, Liz. So Tony McGrath asks, says thanks very much for the great talk. Is there any information on the plaque? When unveiled, commissioned by whom? And it's interesting that the dates are 1916 to 1921, and no mention of the Civil War. To my shame, I don't know anything about the plaque. I always assumed it was the National Graves, but maybe one of you know?
No.
I assumed it was National Graves, but again, could be wrong. Or it could be the 1916-21 club. If it just mentions 1921, if it was National Graves, they would include the Civil War because they were Republican, they were anti-treaty. So it's quite possible that it was the 1916-21 club, which was set up to reunite, to heal the divide of the Civil War. But I'm not sure. This is a guess. It'd be an interesting one to find out. Cathy, that's our homework.
Yeah.
Tara, who's she said her office is in the building, so I think we'll give it to Tara to sort of. Librarians like to have these things to track down. But thanks very much.
Brendan, you're gone quiet.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I have technical difficulty there. I was just saying thanks for the questions, and we'll move on to the next one. We'll get another couple in. So Eddie says, with the damage done to the hall in the aftermath of the battle, did it move somewhere else in the city, either for safety or the extent of the damage? So I presume that's the St Andrew's Hall.
Another good one. I think it remains the St Andrew's Hall. Certainly, I looked forward in a couple of times, and it's still the St Andrew's Hall by 1928. So it's obviously just reinstated. It's part of the Catholic Church's network in the general area. So it certainly goes back to being the Andrews Hall. What they did in the immediate days, I don't know. But it certainly didn't disrupt having funerals in Western Row or anything like that. They are certainly all part of the story. And as I definitely know, by 1928, it still is the St Andrews Catholic Club. It's listed as that.
Thank you. And a related question really from Ashton, who says, did the house, both the Catholic Club and the 3rd Battalion, did they use at the same time? I mean, were they using the same rooms within the houses?
My understanding is they were, because, and how I'm drawing that conclusion is the portraits of Pearse and Clark and Connolly were side by side with the portraits of the local priests from Western Row. So obviously it's used as a boys' club. That seems to have been pretty much what it was, with the billiard table and all the rest of it. But it's also used as a meeting place and a store and an arms dump by the 3rd Battalion. And that night it certainly was being used as a meeting point for the armed men. Imagine what it would have been like if we had mobile phones. That's the bit that I find. This is all word of mouth stuff. So somehow David Kelly gets word that the convoy is on its way down, but he doesn't have enough time really to get up to them. And he's caught in the crossfire. That's how close it is. But they are expecting something, because they extinguished the street light very early to put darkness on the street, and the only thing illuminating the street are the flashes of gunfire from the roof and the windows. So it's all of those things that are part of the actual battle itself. It's very atmospheric when you start thinking of it at that level. What was it like? It's very hard to imagine it like that today. It's a well-lit street, plenty of traffic and people around, people with phones and all the rest of it. But to go back 100 years, you really have to place yourself in the situation then.
And as I was listening to you, I was just wondering, is there any suggestion at all that the information was sort of fed to the auxiliaries to sort of provoke them to come down? I mean, was there any sense of that at all?
Possibility. I somehow, the fact that they had Stephen Clark under observation suggests to me that he might be the man who gave the auxiliaries the information. The fact that he shot a considerable distance from the actual battle site itself suggests again that he is caught as he's going in the alleyways, as retreating gunmen are going through the alleyways. It's hard to say, but certainly the British accounts say that they had been notified there were gunmen in 144. That is very, very clear. I have checked it from the British side. The Irish side, the IRA, tell us that David Kelly, in one or two accounts, we're told that David Kelly was on his way to tell them in 144 that they're on the way. So I don't think they were really setting them up for it. I think they were coming down to raid because in response to the earlier grenade attack on the barracks up at the top of Pearse Street. I think they were coming down to the area. They knew there were armed gunmen in the area, and they were coming down to just stop it before it got any further.
Okay, thanks for that. I just know from Sean saying he would love to know about the plaque. That's from the grandnephew of Leo Fitzgerald. So we're on the case, I can assure you. If one of our historians can't find it, well, nobody can. Colin asks, are there any visible scars on the building? I don't know. I've never noticed any. I have, to be fair to myself, looked at the building a fair amount. I don't know if either of you have any have noticed it. No?
I haven't been down there since lockdown, so I just can't remember.
No, but I would imagine they've been probably well repaired at this stage. But sometimes when you look at it with new eyes, I suspect there might be a lot of people on the top of a double-deck bus going by, checking it out now now that it's sort of been brought to attention. So you may find, so if anybody can locate it or looks like a polyfiller repair somewhere, yeah, please let us know, and we can certainly include it for future presentations on the subject.
Thanks. There's just a note there from one of John Donnelly's relatives saying that he suggested that he was 21 and not 17. So do you have any information about that?
I certainly had it that he was 17, but hands up if I got it wrong. And his age seemed to have been a deciding factor in the fact that he wasn't executed along with Thomas Traynor. But again, hands up, I was working off newspaper accounts, which, as we know, can have errors in them. but you know, and with the lockdown, I was limited for where exactly we could go for double checking things as well. But so if we got it wrong, hands up on that one. But certainly it is said that because of his age, that they, so 17, 21, whatever. But my understanding was he was younger.
Okay, well, thanks for that, both of you. Folks, I think that we'll draw to a close. We managed to answer, I think, nearly all of the questions. I certainly found it a fascinating talk. Thank you for all your kind comments in the chat. And don't forget, we have lots of other history events and heritage events. We're still going despite COVID. And just two you may be interested in, two of our other historians in residence. Cormac Moore is doing a series on Ireland in 1921, a lecture series starting next week. That's presented by Raheny and Dunamead Libraries. And James Curry is talking about rebel Irish women next Wednesday. That's not this Wednesday, next Wednesday, 24th. And that's in cooperation with Ballymun Library. And all that information is available on our website at dublincitylibraries.ie. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank you on behalf of Dublin City Libraries for joining us. Thank my colleague Tara for setting things up. And of course, thank Cathy and Liz for doing such a great job. And the amount of research that goes into these talks, I think we can all see it. And we certainly appreciate it. And I know from the responses of the audience that they appreciate it. And of course, thank you all for joining in the questions and the chat. And we look forward to seeing you again when we have another history heritage event. So from all of us in Dublin City Libraries, have a nice evening. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks a million, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.